Hello, I'm Mariette DiCristina, the Dean of Boston University's College of Communication. I'm also an alum of COM and the parent of a recent BU grad. Welcome to this afternoon's COM Talks event. What's the deal with podcasting? I love the title. In recent years, podcasting has emerged as a popular medium, providing platforms for discussion and as a means to connect with those we might not have been able to connect with otherwise. And in this panel discussion today, which is organized by BU's Alumni Association and this college, today we're going to learn about how podcasting became so popular, what makes a successful product, and get some tips and best practices for starting out in the field. And when you have questions, and I hope you do, please put them in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat. Please also feel free to put those questions in any time. Our moderator may take them anytime along the way. And I promise you there'll be plenty of time to get them discussed and answered later in the session. This session is also being recorded and will be available later, both on COM's website and on its YouTube channel. And now it's my real pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Let's start by saying hello to Andrea Asuaje, who is senior producer at Rococo Punch. Hi there, Andrea. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Prior to her work at Rococo Punch, Andrea was a reporter, producer, and co-host of WBUR's radio series and podcast, Kind World. She's also worked at WGBH and various news organizations in Florida, including the Palm Beach Post and Miami Herald, where she developed her skills in digital storytelling and social media community management. Andrea completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Florida and received her master's degree in journalism with a focus on radio and podcast production right here at BU. She lives in Boston with her partner, and I love the rabbit's name, Falafel, and an enormous collection of baking supplies. Me too, Andrea. She's often on Twitter where you can find her there. So glad you're here.
Thank you.
Now let's say hello to Caitlin Durante, who's a Los Angeles-based comedian, writer, and co-host of the Bechdel Cast, a podcast that examines film through an intersectional feminist lens. Caitlin and co-host Jamie Loftus tour with the podcast across the country and have performed live shows at such festivals as the San Francisco Sketch Fest, New York Comedy Festival, Brooklyn Podcast Festival, and Women in Comedy Festival. The Bechdel Cast has been featured in the New York Times, BuzzFeed, the AV Club, and Vulture, and was nominated for an iHeartRadio Podcast Award for Best Film and TV Podcast, and was named Favorite Comedy Podcast by, I love this name too, Woo-Ha-Ha's Female Comedy Awards. That's awesome. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for reading all of those amazing accomplishments.
I know you feel sometimes I don't know who they're talking about when they're introducing me, but you're awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now let's say hello to Alexander Hyacinthe, who's a media professional currently working as producer at ESPN Daily Podcast, hosted by Pablo Torre. Nice to see you there, Alex.
How's everybody doing? Thanks.
Since receiving his MS in journalism from BU in 2014, he's worked at MLB Network as an associate producer and joined the sports betting media startup, The Action Network, as segment producer. Prior to attending BU, he graduated from Cornell University into myriad management jobs, where he ultimately realized that 30 was not too old to pursue his dream career. He says he also stumbles around Twitter, but that's not true. He's actually very awesome, spouting takes on sports, media, culture, politics, video games, rap music, and occasionally anime. Awesome. Nice to see you, Alex. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, after which I'll turn over the virtual mic. Doug Most is the Assistant VP Executive Editor of the Editorial Department at BU today. He's a lifelong journalist and author whose career has spanned newspapers and magazines up and down the East Coast, with stops in Washington, D.C., South Carolina, New Jersey, and Boston. After a stint at Boston Magazine, he worked for more than a decade at the Boston Globe in various roles, including magazine editor and deputy managing editor of special projects. His 2014 book, nonfiction book, The Race Underground, told the story about the birth of the subways in America and was made into a PBS American Experience documentary. He has a BA from George Washington University in political communication. Doug, thank you so much for moderating today. And now I'll shut my camera off, but I'm going to stick around and thank you and turn the camera over to you.
Thanks for the introductions, and thanks everyone to the panelists for being here, and thanks to our audience for being here. We're all excited to have you. As was explained, we'll be keeping an eye out for questions throughout the event. So pop them in there as you hear them. We'll keep an eye out for them. Just a couple of things to get us going, and then we'll start off. So first of all, podcasting. I took some time to do a little research on sort of where things stand right now in the podcasting industry. So for example, I thought you'd be interested to know that the most popular subjects when it comes to podcasting are news and comedy. They are the most popular subjects right now when it comes to podcasting, by far, in fact. But after that, music, politics, true crime, and business are sort of the next categories that are most popular. So that's sort of interesting that it goes news and comedy and then music, politics, true crime, and business. The most popular format for podcasting, and I think our panelists will all be able to talk about this, which will be helpful, is where the host has a conversation with a different guest each session. That's sort of the format that most listeners seem to like the most. But the other format that a lot of people seem to enjoy is when there are sort of two co-hosts who sort of are bantering with each other. That back and forth, it sounds like really works for a lot of people, and they like having two people sort of having a conversation. So those are the formats that seem to work. Money. Let's talk about money for a minute. The podcasting industry is expected to hit $2 billion in advertising revenue in 2023. So it is an exploding and continually growing industry of revenue for publishers, for the media, and for individuals who are producing podcasts. There's a lot of opportunity out there. And as we all know, podcasting is a great vehicle for brands to hyper target their audience. So for brands who want to reach a very specific niche audience, advertisers are really flocking to podcasting. One of the reasons why podcasts do well with advertisers is that 8 of every 10 podcast listeners listen to almost or most of an entire episode. So they don't just start it, but when you start a podcast episode, there's very high likelihood you're going to finish that episode. And that's why advertisers see a lot of value in it. So that's an interesting sort of point that I'm sure we'll get to today. There's a lot of noise out there when it comes to podcasting, and I'm sure this is going to come up in the questions. How do you break through? There are more than 2 million podcasts available. 2 million. That's a lot of podcasts out there. So, but that doesn't mean you should be daunted by that. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but it's just a thing to keep in mind. And then length, and I'm sure we'll talk about this today. The average length of a podcast episode used to be about 42 minutes. It's now down to 37 minutes. So it's going down a little bit, but still sort of it shows you that longer than a half an hour is fine. Nothing wrong with that. And that's sort of good to know. So with that, we're going to dip into some different subjects. And like I've said, feel free to pop questions in there as we're talking. For starters, why don't we talk about each of you, what I'd love to hear is a little personal experience. Can you talk about your first dip into podcasting? Sort of what started you off? How did you sort of decide that you wanted to try podcasting? Was there maybe a podcast you had listened to that sort of caught your ear and made you think that sounds fun? Or was it maybe you were in a different form of medium and you thought you would try something different? But why don't we start with Caitlin first? Why don't you start us off and just talk about your first dip into podcasting, how it began and what it was like?
Sure. Well, I had recently finished my master's at BU and had moved to LA to pursue comedy and screenwriting. And I was like, well, I'm a comedian in LA. It's sort of illegal for me to not have a podcast as per the law. So I was like, well, I guess I have to like make a name for myself somehow as a like comedic persona. So I thought to myself, what do I know anything about? And really the only answer to that question is movies. So I was like, okay, I'll do a movie podcast. Because I mean, especially in the industry, and this is something we can talk about, and podcasting and entertainment in general, you know, there's so much competition, there's so much just you have to figure out a way to break into it and then get a break from there. So podcasting was like the avenue that seemed most conducive to sort of like parlay that into the other things I am interested in doing with my career. So I was like, all right, I'm going to start this movie podcast. I contacted a friend who I knew would be a great co-host, and we just kind of went from there. I pitched her this specific idea that I had where I was like, I love movies, but I have to reconcile how much so many of my favorite movies are really problematic and awful to women and awful to people of color, and just, just problematic in every way. And I was like, well, that's something I could talk about. That's a thing. That's a podcast right there. So we just, that was sort of the idea that we jumped off from. And then I happened to have access from where I worked at the time, which was at a comedy venue that also had a podcast studio kind of affiliated with it. So I had access to all this equipment and a studio, and a producer friend who worked for the place. Just I had kind of everything already ready to go for me.
So you had some connections, which helps.
I had some connections, and then things just kind of unfolded from there. But yeah, that's sort of the origin story for me.
That's great. It's interesting. Okay, cool. Alex, can you tell us sort of your origin story?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on what Caitlin laid down there at the end, that the relationship she had with the producer friend was vital in kind of getting her launched and getting her access. And relationships are kind of what launched me. I was working in video. I had been at MLB Network, which is a live TV situation. And then I was at the Action Network, which was a digital media situation. And when the Action Network as a startup decided to kind of change their philosophy and go away from video, there was no job for me. But because of the people I had worked with, because of the relationships I had formed with them, and because I took a lot of pride in working well, working hard, and always answering the bell, a lot of people around me kind of became advocates for me. And it wasn't long at all before my name was slid across the desk of the powers that be at ESPN, and luckily they were launching something, and it was an adjustment. I had come from 5 years of video and was transitioning into audio, but I think what really worked in my benefit was that podcasts had kind of become a passion of mine. I was commuting from southern Westchester County to New Jersey by Giant Stadium every day at MLB Network, and I got sick of mumble rap and started listening to podcasts, and fiction podcasts and sports podcasts and anything I could get my hands on, and just fell in love with the space. While everything in cinema and in streaming was becoming Marvel, podcast seemed like the area where you could tell an original comedy about a family running a funeral home in London and the hijinks they get into. It's a show called Wood and Overcoats, and it just really spoke to me. So kind of building my skill set by listening, I think really helped open the door for me.
Great, thanks. Andrea.
Yeah, I am a long-time podcast listener. I'm a lifelong musician, and so I've always been drawn to sound. And I knew that I wanted to study journalism in undergrad, and so that's kind of how I went into. I actually, my undergrad is in print journalism, so with specifically with reporting, and so I was really into reading long form pieces, and then I had an iPod, and suddenly they started putting things that were on NPR on RSS feeds, and they would show up on your iPod. And I started to listen to This American Life. And because the only things that were really on an RSS feed were these basically NPR shows that they would just kind of throw up and see if they would work on digital networks, on Apple Podcasts. Really, that was the only really thing that was creating podcasts. And I listened to so many episodes of This American Life because I loved that kind of storytelling. And it was a moment where, I was in my undergrad and I went through with that, and I worked in newspapers for a while. And I had worked in several papers, and I had always kind of kept this in the back of my mind, how much I loved podcasts and my love of audio and sound. And then one day I just decided, I was like, you know what, if I don't do this now, I don't think I'm ever going to do it. And I quit my job and I had a panic attack in a stairwell. And then I went to BU because I knew that with the demands of my job, I wouldn't be able to learn the skills on the job.
Right.
And so I said to myself, this is a sabbatical. It's a really expensive sabbatical. And after school, I will get a job and hopefully it will be in radio. But if it's not, then we will figure it out. I know that it's possible to get a job in this field. It's a lot of work, but I know it's possible. And so when I got to BU, I just worked my butt off to get any opportunity I could in podcasting and radio in like the radio stations. So I worked at BUR, I got a fellowship there, and I asked for my fellowship to be with the iLab, which is the podcast department at WBUR.
Right.
And that's really when I started doing actual work in podcasting.
So that was smart of you. That was smart of you to sort of like really like decide you wanted to get some hands-on experience and watch it being done.
Yeah, because I went into school knowing I'm like, I need to learn these skills now.
Right.
So I had a very clear vision. And so I actually ended up interning and working about 8 months for the show that a few years later I would take over. Total coincidence. And yeah, I just kind of went from there. I worked at BUR, I worked at GBH after graduating from BU, and I worked in radio at GBH, kind of working on my producer skills. I had always just wanted to be a producer. And then when I went to BUR, I was offered the position of co-host of Kind World. And that was not expected. I did not expect to be in front of the microphone at all, ever. And now at Rococo, I'm back behind the mic, which is what I like.
That's great.
So yeah, producer and showrunner.
That's great. One of the things I want to make sure we talk about next is sort of, I think what a lot of people are probably just interested in is just how do you get started, right? I mean, can we talk for a minute about sort of a two-pronged question here, tips for just getting started, dipping your toes into this water where there are 2 million podcasts out there, how to not feel daunted by that and not be overwhelmed by that. And at the same time, can you talk a little bit about how to try to break through the noise and get heard? Tips for sort of like getting your podcast out there and getting it seen by people, or should I say heard by people. Just on a personal level, I just finished listening to a podcast. It was called The Rumor. I had never heard of it. I stumbled onto it. A friend of mine mentioned it to me in passing. And I was like, oh, I'll check it out. And then I found myself sort of riveted to it. I listened in the car. It was only 9 episodes. Each one was, I think, about 40, 45 minutes or so. It was sports related, which was appealing to me. I wasn't sure if it would work. I remember listening to the first 20 minutes and thinking like, how are they going to drag this out for 9 episodes? I felt like after I learned what The Rumor was, I was almost like done. And then I was like, all right, I'll keep going. And then I was hooked and I kept going. And I think it was the appeal of the 2 hosts. It had a format of 2 people talking, and they were friendly and their banter was really lively and engaging. I think that worked. They made it very personal. That also worked. I sort of related to them and their backgrounds. So anyway, can you talk a little bit about just getting started and tips for sort of dipping your toes into the water? Maybe talk a little bit about equipment, things that might be helpful for people who are thinking about getting started. And then also talk about the next sort of level of, okay, you started, how do you get people to hear it and to be heard? And just sort of in the interest of making sure we move this along, we'll try to keep our answers to 2-3 minutes, just sort of keep it so we're feeling like we're getting to different topics. So how about Caitlin? Why don't you start us off? Or actually, Caitlin, you started us off last time. Let me go to Alex first, and then we'll go to Andrea.
So I'm very passionate about the idea that content is king.
Yeah.
Every Major League Baseball player played Little League. Everybody in the NFL played high school football. And definitely have your eyes on where you want to end up. but the most important thing is to generate content.
Right.
And I don't care if you have a Shure mic or you're using the built-in mic on your MacBook Pro. Record, create content, create 5-minute sound bites, create 30-minute episodes, share those on Twitter, use the right hashtags, share them around events that are going on. When opportunity arises, you kind of want to have a briefcase full of proof that you can do this, that you have done this. The other thing that'll happen as you're creating content is that you're going to get better at it. You're going to realize what works and why this question was too wordy and why you didn't ask this person the proper question. None of that happens if you sit around and are concerned about what mic you have, or if you want to pay for Squadcast versus Zoom. Beginning is beginning. Like every journey starts with the first step. So I just want to encourage everyone watching, everyone interested, don't be afraid to make content and don't be afraid to share that content. You're your own best advocate. Twitter can do amazing things. And you don't want opportunity to arise and you not be ready to take advantage of it.
So even as simple as using like the audio voice memo app on your iPhone, like, would you encourage people to like start with that? Like, there's no reason not to.
100%. And listen back with a critical ear. If you're recording with voice memo and you're doing it in your living room and you realize that there's a lot of room tone, maybe try it in your bedroom, try it in your closet, try it. Like every swing will make you a better hitter. And I just really believe in that.
That's great. Andrea, how about you?
I agree with that in terms of production, like just making stuff will make you better.
Yeah.
Also, just a note, voice memo is of broadcast level quality. We use voice memos on NPR.
Okay.
So like you can start
No shame. No shame.
Absolutely not. We have done that, like no problem at all. I think producing content, just making stuff and finding what you want to do in this field. Like, do you want to be a host? Then you really need to develop your own voice. You have to find what you're going to be good at. You got to find, are you better with another person? How do you write banter? Or do you want to go into this more of a narrative format? Are you a journalist? Do you have those reporting skills, et cetera, et cetera? Once you have those skills, then you can learn the more like technical production skills like Audition or Pro Tools. You find the right mic for you, find big headphones for you, you find a quiet space. But having those kinds of building blocks of like knowing what you want to do in this space, it's kind of like if you're going into video, we never say there's so many videos on YouTube. There's so many movies on Netflix. Like
right.
More podcasts means more content, means more voices out there. And there's a lot of stuff out there, but it's possible that yours could be the next big one. Great.
Caitlin, go, and then we're going to grab some of these questions. I'm glad to see some questions popping in, so I'm going to read some of those and we'll get a chance to answer some. So, but Caitlin, first jump in on this.
Yeah, so I would come at it kind of from a creative point of view where, yes, there are already 2 million podcasts out there circulating in the world, but there are also 7 billion people-ish, give or take, and most people who listen to podcasts listen to more than one. So there's not as though like, oh, I can't start a podcast. There's already so many out there. As long as you have, if you can like tap into a very niche thing, which is what so many podcasts are, is like you just like find a niche market, find like, a show that you like or whatever, a movie that you like or something that you like that hasn't already been talked to death on an existing podcast. Because there's so much room for that still. Figure out the format that works best for you, which will take a lot of practice. And like the first like 20 episodes of my podcast, like I'm embarrassed that they exist because we were babies, we didn't know what we were doing, we were just starting out, and now I'm like, oh yikes. But the more you do it, the more seasoned you'll get. As far as like a few helpful tools to get started, if you're like, well, where do I even begin? There's something called anchor.fm and riverside.fm, and they're two sites that basically, either one of the Riverside sort of just like an online recording studio almost. It's sort of like you meet in a Zoom-like meeting, but then you have the capacity to record that. And then Anchor is a site that lets you basically upload your podcast to all of the major platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the other ones, I don't know.
Yeah.
But so those are worth looking into, just as far as like, okay, how do I even do step one kind of thing? So
all right, great. So I want to get to some of these questions, and I'm seeing some overlap on them. So I'm going to pick different people to sort of answer them. We don't all have to weigh in on them. Let's talk for a minute about monetizing and advertising, because that's a question I think that's going to come up a lot. So someone is asking, do you have any tips for advertising podcast? And then someone else is asking, can you speak to monetizing sort of an existing sort of 2-year-old podcast with a small audience, but really good content, but they've never monetized it before? So let me go back to Andrea for a minute. Andrea, can you talk for a minute about monetizing and advertising? And also someone else asked the question of finding the right and appropriate advertiser. So maybe I'll leave that one for Alex when we come to you, finding the right and appropriate advertiser. But Andrea, maybe you start us off talking about monetizing a 2-year-old podcast with great content, but a small audience, and just tips for advertising.
So that's really tricky, right? Because it used to be, and I am not an ad or money specialist. Right. I'm more on the creative side of this. Mm-hmm. But it used to be, and this could be wrong now, that you would get the attention of advertisers once you got 100,000 downloads per episode. 100,000
per episode. Okay.
Yeah. That was like kind of that
was the benchmark, essentially.
Like a gold standard, because that means that like you have enough followers or downloads and listeners that you're consistent. And so people will want to invest and be in your mid-roll.
Okay.
That could be different now because so many people are trying to advertise on podcasts. So it might be about, like, someone asked about finding the right ones, and I think Alex will talk on that. But finding instead of saying like, well, I want Casper Mattress to advertise on my show, like they're looking at the high money end. So it might be like finding a local sponsor or smaller businesses or something like that as you're building your audience. Mm-hmm. It's also, I mean, I work for an independent production company for stuff like that. Like, we co-produce with bigger markets.
Okay.
So we'll say like, we'll do a co-production with Spotify because they have a platform and they have built-in ad revenue or whatever. So it really depends on like the kind of show you're making, what your goals are. Like if you want to leave your job and be a podcast producer, like that's a lot of hustle. It's going to be hard if you're on your own entirely, but it kind of depends on the show that you have. I'll toss it to Alex because I think, he can probably speak on that.
Yeah, to pick up on it, I think first and foremost, draw a line in the sand in terms of what, products you would want to represent. You don't want to get into a sponsorship arrangement with something that you don't believe in or support. That's only going to lead to trouble down the line. Yeah. I think as you're growing, the biggest thing you can do is take a look around at other podcasts. Check out the podcasts that are getting 25,000 downloads. Go on Twitch and look at the Twitch streamers that have small to intermediate sized audiences and kind of see who's sponsoring them. Shoot an email, ask them, hey, how did you meet up with, XYZ widget company?
Right.
And take the opportunity to cold call. I really do like the angle of local sponsorship. I think that's a way to build your reputation within your own community environment. Right. And you're not going to become a millionaire, being sponsored by the deli on the corner, but every little bit helps. So definitely,
and you build relationships that way as well.
Relationships. And so, doing a little bit of legwork and homework to kind of identify where you are in the space, I think can go a long way to kind of letting you know where your opportunities are going to lie.
Great, thanks. I want to grab this question for Caitlin because from a comedian. Someone asks, there's a lot of comedy podcasts out there, and there's a lot of noise out there in the comedy podcast world. And as we talked about at the beginning, comedy is one of the sort of popular fields for podcasting. So the question is that, do you have a recommendation on sort of when you should perhaps pivot or change your show if you feel like it's not working, and a recommended goal to sort of target downloads, growth to know you're on the right track? I've seen a lot of comics put a lot of work into well-produced podcasts, but folks just aren't listening to them. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as far as, oh gosh, well, if you need to pivot because you're discovering that your format isn't really working, or just something isn't quite lining up, there's no shame in that. My podcast, we didn't do a very significant pivot, but at one point we realized, wow, we're focusing way too much on something a little bit too, not even too broad, but we were like, we're ignoring some aspects of like intersectionality when it came to like our film analysis. So we're like, let's kind of pivot, wasn't even the right word, but it's like, let's just make sure we're being more inclusive and more intersectional in our approach. And this is something that we like discussed on an entire episode. We're like, this is what we're going to do from this point on. So, I mean, if that's something you need to do and you like want to actually address it on the podcast, sometimes you can just sort of like seamlessly do it behind the scenes.
Right.
But yeah, there is a lot of, there are unfortunately some podcasts that, they're kind of doing everything right, but they're not necessarily getting the downloads or the listens. And that I think leads to a discussion about promotion, which is, how do you do that? For my just speaking from my personal experience, we started out where we only, for the first probably like year of the podcast, we only had on average 500 to 1,000 downloads per episode, which is nowhere near that benchmark of like 100,000 downloads per episode to get advertisers interested in you. But that's how, most podcasts start out, unless you're already like an A-list celebrity who decides to start a podcast. So if you're just kind of like, putzing around trying to figure out what you're doing with your life, like I was, you start a podcast, it takes some time. It takes, I kind of called in some favors from like comedians who are more famous than me to be a guest, and then they would retweet their episode, and then people would listen to it based on that, and then like get hooked on my podcast. We reached out to publications that do kind of like listicles about podcasts, or say like, here's something to check out, and then we're like, could you please consider us? And then sometimes it worked. So like we got write-ups in the AV Club and different things like that, because we just sort of did some cold calling and a little bit of just promo by begging people to listen to our podcast. And
are there regarding promotion, have you found that there are certain platforms or methods that really worked better than others, like just in terms of like these were the ones that just seemed to have the most effect?
Honestly, it was, for me, my podcast specifically, it was getting people who already had a platform and already had a following to be a guest, and then ask them kindly to like promote the episode they were on. Because we've had so many people be like, oh, I found this podcast because I listened to the Nikki Glazer episode, or something like that, so, or the Nicole Byer episode. So that was really helpful. I also wanted just to quickly talk about the monetization thing again, because the focus was on advertising, but there are other ways to monetize your podcast. And while my podcast is now on a network and we do like advertising stuff, I make most of the money from the podcast that I do, which is like my living currently. So I'm like making a living by hosting a podcast. Take that, Mom. No, I'm kidding. But we make most of our money through Patreon. So if you have, I would say like establish a little bit of a like a log of episodes, a little bit of a following before you dive into the Patreon side of things. But once you have like a steady and consistent listenership, even if it's not that big, even if it is only a few hundred people, if you can get even like a percentage of them to subscribe to your Patreon, and
explain what that is, just for those of us who
absolutely.
might be sort of wondering, just a real brief explanation.
Sure. And I think there are other similar platforms like it,
Okay.
but Patreon's probably the most popular one, where it's just an avenue where you can release episodes, you can release content of any kind, a lot of like musicians, photographers, artists, like just any really creative medium. You can post basically bonus content there.
Okay.
That is accessible only to your Patreon subscribers. So your Patreons, you can say like, it's $5 a month to subscribe. And you can have also different tiers. So you're like, if you do the $5 tier, you get this content. If you do 10 or 15 or $20, you get this, you set all the parameters of everything. But then you have a steady stream of revenue from like your most loyal and like diehard fans. And then you do generally have to put in a little bit of extra work in terms of like giving them extra content, or sometimes it's just like, get the episode 3 days earlier if you subscribe to the page, things like that.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because it makes me think that it's important for people to realize that subscribers, it's not about how many, it's about how loyal. And if you find an audience that really likes your content and really is into it, they may be willing to pay. And even, I'm sure if someone could do the math, but it's probably better to have 100 really loyal listeners who are willing to pay X amount for that content, as opposed to 1,000 listeners who they maybe forget about it. They aren't loyal, but they have heard of it. There's something to be said for that loyalty, because those are people who perhaps are really willing to put in their credit card and fork over $5, $10, $20, and that money adds up after a while.
Totally.
I have a quick question for you, Caitlin. When you were establishing your Patreon and offering bonus content, were there any fears or concerns about potentially driving away a portion of your audience by putting some content behind the paywall?
We didn't ever have that concern, really, because there were enough of our listeners that were like, and this is going to sound like a big brag, but they were like, how we want to support you financially. Can we, because if you put your podcast on Apple Podcasts, any of these platforms, it's free. So, and most listeners understand that you as a podcaster need to earn money somehow through your podcast or some other means. So they were like, but we like this show, we want to support it financially. So we had enough people who were already willing to do that. And honestly, I found the opposite to be true in terms of like people, like the subscribers. So I guess like when we were like, hey, we're going to do a Patreon, it didn't drive anyone away. It just made people more excited about that now they're like, oh, we're on this now, like bonus secret content. And the like, as a like socialist, I'm like, I'm not going to make it so unaffordable that so we just have one tier. It's $5 a month. It's generally affordable. So that's just how we do it.
Let's talk for a minute. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Let audacity override fear for the audience watching out. Like, do it. I knew that was Caitlin's answer, and I knew that was kind of her thought process. And like, great. Allow that audacity to override your hesitation or fear.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Caitlin, because I was like, I need her to speak up about this, because she knows about the move from indie to big network.
Yeah,
which is big. I will say one really quick thing, that a huge promotion tool for like Caitlin said, like listicles and places like Vulture that have podcast specific like weekly columns, and like you can pitch all these people, right? You can pitch Nick Quah, you can pitch Allison Carmen at The Verge, who writes Hot Pod, which is if you're interested in podcasting, like that is a podcast industry newsletter that goes out like multiple times a week for subscribers. And then of course, like the absolute like gold star that will get you a buttload of listeners is the Apple feature, right? Which is like weeks and months of essentially like petitioning and working every angle you can get to get an Apple Carousel feature.
Okay.
Mhm.
That's great.
It's also
So
helpful to, sorry to interrupt, but
No.
I was gonna say, it's also helpful to ask your listeners to like rate and review
Yes.
your podcast on whatever platform. Because the more like positive reviews and like stars you have, like that's gonna elevate your like stats and stuff.
Yeah, it essentially triggers an algorithm.
Mhm.
So let's talk for a minute about analytics and metrics. There's a couple questions that have popped up about it. Is there one, and I'll start with you, Andrea, is there one useful source for analytics on podcasting and metrics and sort of, or is it just sort of each platform has their own sort of, Spotify has it and Apple has it, and there's sort of, are there different, or is there one that like is an easy sort of one to just grab for metrics and analytics?
I know of two that are widely used both in podcasting and in public media, which are Chartable and Megaphone.
Right.
But Megaphone is also interesting because it will dynamically insert ads for you once it gets to a certain point. It's like that's a higher level like podcast. A lot of big platforms use something like Megaphone, like an iHeart or a Spotify. I don't know enough about how each individual platform presents its analytics. Caitlin, you might have a better grasp on that than I do, because I also don't often have to look behind the scenes there. We look at things once they are out there, basically, and see if we have to make moves depending on listenership or, when people are listening, how people are listening, stuff like that.
Yep. Okay. That's great. Anyone else want to jump in on that before I move on?
We at ESPN use Megaphone for our
Okay.
podcast metrics. A lot like Andrea, I'm not actually generating reports and things like that.
Yeah.
The company handles a lot of that kind of stuff, but you can see everything down to when people stop listening.
Correct.
How many people listen through mid-roll, how many people skip through the mid-rolls, like things like that. So that's the service I definitely would recommend. I don't know if it's free. I don't know what the subscription model is, but I know that's what we use.
So I want to pivot for a minute. So my group has started a podcast, and when I started it, I said I wanted it to be short. And so ours is roughly 10 to 12 minutes. It varies. Sometimes it's 7 minutes, but it's averaged around 10 minutes. But seeing the research that I saw that, actually 35, 40 minutes is perfectly acceptable and maybe even the average. Can you talk a little about length and sort of whether you should get hung up on length? And is it okay to do a 5-minute podcast, or is that like almost too short and not worth the effort? And is longer better? Can you talk a little bit about length? Alex, why don't you jump in for a minute?
So pre-pandemic, we were targeting and saw a lot of growth in the commuter market. And in that area, you're kind of targeting 25 to 40 minutes. That's how long a train ride is, a drive to work, et cetera, et cetera. Commuting went away for 2 years. And that kind of changed the way that we looked at who was listening and how they were listening. And our new target became the fabled dog walker, however long it takes somebody to walk their dog and do their business.
That's funny. Okay.
You're going to have episodes that are going to be longer and more complicated, but I am a proponent of brevity, maybe not in the 5-minute range, but if you can live in that 25 to 35-minute range, I think you're serving a listener that listens to multiple podcasts, that has a diverse set of needs of their time. They may be working from home, they may be commuting, they may be driving to the grocery store. That's enough time to get somebody in and involved in an episode. I listen to pods that are much longer than that. But I would say that sweet spot's about 25 to 35, 40 minutes.
How about Caitlin? How about you? Any thoughts on this?
Oh yeah, I have so many. I think it all depends on what the content is or what the subject is. Like if you are just doing like hey, here's news highlights for the day. Like, yeah, you can probably get that in 10 to 15 minutes. If you're doing an in-depth film analysis, sometimes your episode is longer than the movie you're analyzing. I don't know,
Right.
just not speaking from personal experience or anything like that. But yeah, so I think it has everything to do with, I would worry less about time length and more about quality of what you're putting out. That said, there are definitely episodes that we recorded for like 2.5 hours, yikes, that I then edited down to like 2 hours.
That's one long dog walk, let me tell you.
Yeah, so you're welcome, everybody. But I think editing is a helpful friend in terms of podcasting as well.
Tell me if this is accurate, because as someone who's written a book, someone once said to me that you better like what you're writing about because you're going to be married to it, and they sort of compared writing a book to sort of a marriage, that you're going to be stuck with it for a while, so you better like it. Do you think there's a good lesson in there for sort of creating content like podcasts, where it's really important that you pick subjects that you're passionate about, that you're excited about, that you're interested in, because that passion and that excitement will come through in your content, in your podcast? The old saying, write what you know, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an old cliche that we've all heard. Does that apply to podcasting? Speak what you know and podcast what you know. Do you think that's true?
100%.
Yeah.
I basically cultivated my life so that I watch movies and then talk about movies for a living, and that's exactly what I've wanted to do my entire life.
Okay.
So
there's
yeah,
something in there. Yeah.
For sure.
As a host,
Yeah.
I would say yes. As a producer, not necessarily.
Okay.
My job is to craft stories.
Yep.
I am a sports fanatic,
Okay.
but if I was working in money, I would still be trying to craft exquisite episodes about the topic each day. As a host, absolutely. You're married to the content. It's going to come across if you don't believe in or care about what you're talking about. But as a professional producer who's very rarely on the microphone, the story is the king.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Oh, can I do?
Yeah,
I have
please.
time
Good. Jump
for
in.
something? I would say that it also depends on the kind of show that you're making. Like Caitlin's show is like what she and her co-host Jamie do is very much kind of they are sharing their knowledge and going into, it's very tied with the personal and your experience, and there's a lot there, right? Right now we're airing a show that we made called Finding Raffi, which is about the musician Raffi, and I had no idea who he was, and I was essentially married to this subject since last June.
Did you find Raffi, or are we not allowed to know?
Of course. I've spoken with Raffi many times. But so like Alex said, I am married to the subject matter and making sure that this narrative is beautiful, but I have to make sure that my host likes what we're doing and can communicate both the story, but also is comfortable sharing his story, and also communicating to our audience that this is something that they should listen to week after week.
The Wheels on the Bus is an absolute classic.
Yes, right.
Baby Beluga, man.
Baby Beluga. Oh, actually, that's like creating now it's going to be in my head for the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Just so we know, for the 100 or so people who seem to be with us here, I want to mention, someone posted a question about making an available list of some of these great resources that we've all been talking about today, and I think that would be a valuable thing. We will try to find a way to put that together. Maybe I'll have the panelists sort of send us something, and I'll work with the School of Communication, and we'll find a way to get that list and perhaps push it out there to people who registered for this podcast and signed up for it, if that's possible. I don't know if I'm saying something I'm not sure it's possible, but we will try to do that and get that list together, because I think the resources you've all said, including the Patreon and some other things, I think have been really valuable. So we will try to do that. Thank you for that question. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't briefly talk about Joe Rogan. The podcasting universe has been, a buzz with this whole question of the ethical responsibility of streaming services versus freedom of content and all of that. I'm going to guess that everyone on this panel has an opinion on this, whether you side with Joe Rogan or side with Spotify on this. I don't know. Where do you come down? Alex, how about you? Do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I am not in any way, shape, or form in favor of censorship. I am not in any way, shape, or form here for racism or for misinformation. There's a line. I think that if you pretend you don't know where the line, I think if you pretend that you don't know where the line is, you're being disingenuous.
Yep.
I think he was being disingenuous, and there's room for shock jocks without crossing that line.
Okay.
Spotify's call is going to be Spotify's call on what they do with it. But his content's not something I was consuming anyway.
Okay, fair enough. Andrea or Caitlin, you want to jump in, or if you don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, that's okay too.
No,
go ahead.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, Caitlin.
I was going to say, I don't know enough about this specific thing to say anything other than I already hate Joe Rogan.
Okay.
The end.
The end. Good enough.
Yeah. I don't consume Joe Rogan's podcast. I know what he does. I have listened to it before. It is not something that I would normally listen to. And to say, like, to be on the side of Joe Rogan, to be on the side of Spotify, they're the same side. Joe Rogan and Spotify are essentially allies in this. And they are against, or, we're the other side, the audience, right? And like Alex said, I am a huge fan of the First Amendment. It's my favorite.
All the amendments.
And so, I don't want anyone to feel like they're being censored, but there is something to be said about hate speech and misinformation, and that is not protected. Hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. It is, or rather something that poses clear and present danger is not protected, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that someone on Twitter said, like, right now, Spotify is basically like Joe Rogan is caged in Spotify.
Right.
If Spotify lets him go, then he returns to all platforms. Do we want that?
Right. Is that a good thing
it's
or a bad thing?
Precarious situation.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I want to do a little bit of a lightning round here. I'm going to take some of these questions. I'm just going to throw them at you, and they can be 2-word answers, and that's okay. But just to try to get to some of these people who were kind enough to sort of stick with us through this thing and throw some questions in our thing. So what's the right frequency for a specialized podcast? Does it have to be weekly? Can it be monthly? Can it be 6 months? Does it have to be daily? Let me throw that to Alex.
I work on a daily podcast. I am addicted to the grind of a daily podcast. But I don't think that every podcast needs to be daily. Like you know what your content is and what the appetite and desire is for it.
But is monthly not frequent enough though? Like
I do not think monthly is frequent enough. It should be out at least twice a week.
Okay. All right, that's good. Editing software. Caitlin, do you have an editing software you like?
Yes, I do. Although I would not necessarily recommend it because it is not specifically audio editing software, but I learned how to use Final Cut when I was in film school. So that's just what I use to edit audio. Although the more commonly used ones are like Adobe Audition and oh gosh, I don't even know what else. But yeah, I use Pro Tools. I use Final Cut like a weirdo.
Okay, let's say you're talking to podcast guests who might be international. They're not in the same location as you, they're overseas. Is there a particular tip or advice or tool that you might use for audio quality to sort of ensure that you get the best audio quality as possible? Andrea, jump.
I send them to a studio.
You send them to a studio. Interesting.
Yeah, I send them to a studio near where they are. Or I use, Caitlin, I think, mentioned Riverside. We'll send Riverside, and we actually send microphones to people because we have a preferred USB microphone we send them, and sometimes it's cheaper than sending them to a studio, and we will then connect via Riverside. Honestly, the harder part of that is scheduling between your host and an international guest.
How about Zoom? Can you talk for a minute? Is the Zoom record, is that quality not good enough? No,
it's not
great.
Okay, all right, good to know. Okay, I'm just looking to see these questions that have come along.
Real quick, in terms of audio quality, if you can do nothing except guarantee that your guest is wearing headphones, that's going to help a long way, because then you're
Okay.
not going to have that microphone bleed. If you
Okay.
can do nothing else, make sure that their audio is not coming from their speakers and going into their mic.
We talked briefly about Apple and Spotify and the big platforms. Is it difficult to get any podcast on there, or is that something that anybody can do? You may not be able to get it into the carousel or get it sort of promoted, but can you just get a podcast into Apple and Spotify relatively simply?
Yeah, it's the other way that's hard.
Meaning
So,
what?
I mean, like if you use Anchor
Yep.
will send your podcast to every podcast platform.
Got it.
Spotify, Apple, iHeart, Pocket Casts, everything. Getting something on the carousel or a new and noteworthy, that's where the hustle is.
Okay. Got it. And last question that I'm seeing here, and then we'll sort of wrap up in a minute. Narrative-based podcasts, sort of the narrative storytelling, can you talk for a minute about narrowing down that angle that you choose to talk about, and sort of, is there a trick to a narrative podcast? The one that I listened to, The Rumor, was a narrative podcast. It sort of told a story in sort of chronological order in a way, and it worked for me. Are you a fan of narrative podcasts? We all know Serial and how that sort of, started this, well, not started, but certainly was a big contributor to the growth of that universe. Who wants to jump in on that? Andrea, you want to go?
That is like kind of our specialty here
Yeah.
at Rococo, is sound rich narrative podcasts.
Right.
That's, what I usually work on. We have very few. We don't have any chat-based shows. We have a few interview-based shows. So guest, like host and guest, but I don't think we've ever had two hosts. So yeah, narrowing a narrative podcast for a long form, like a limited series or even a multi-season series.
Yeah.
Narratives are expensive. They take
Yep.
a long time. They have a big, lots of production people behind them. So they are a harder sell for the platforms. But it's kind of like if you're working on a multi-part series for a newspaper or a magazine, or if you're writing a book.
Yep.
Right? You're going to put in a year and a half, 2 years into something, maybe more. If you listen to the Trojan Horse Affair that came out in the New York Times last week, it's the latest season of Serial Productions that took years and years to make. And so, narrowing their focus is just like you would narrow the focus of writing a book or even making a documentary.
Yeah. I want to give each of you a chance to give one example. And yes, you only get to pick one example of a podcast that you loved. And I'm not looking to plug the podcast. I think it's more important that you're sharing a podcast that just sort of like everything about it worked. Whether it was the sound and it was the storytelling or it was the format or whatever it was, something about it, it was just like bingo. It did what a podcast should do. So it's less about the plug and more about the work. So Caitlin, you want to go?
This might sound weird, but I love the Spanish Duolingo podcast.
Okay.
Because I'm learning Spanish, and it's like a helpful thing just to like facilitate that learning. And then also the stories are really good, and the quality is like the audio quality is, all the technical stuff is really well done.
Right.
It's like really all the episodes tug at your heartstrings.
Okay.
It's like a very
That's great.
emotionally engaging podcast. So yeah, that's what I'll be.
Okay.
Spanish Duolingo podcast.
Spanish Duolingo. Not what I was expecting.
I know.
Andrea, go.
My favorite show of 2020 was The Atlantic's podcast Floodlines about Hurricane Katrina.
Huh.
Unbelievably beautiful podcast, one of the best sounding podcasts I have ever heard.
Wow. Okay.
And then I do have to say our podcast, The Turning, The Sisters Who Left, is one of the best investigative shows that I've ever heard.
Cool. Great. Floodlight. I'll have to look for that one.
Outside of ESPN Daily, the Lore podcast is just amazing storytelling.
What's it called? The Lord?
The Lore
Lore.
podcast.
Lore. Got it.
Yeah. So the host basically goes through the lore and stories from different cultures and environments, myths, and tries to like ground them in real life. And it's just really good storytelling, really excellent sound design. And it just constantly gives me new ways to kind of think about how to tackle sharing stories and crafting and shaping stories.
Great. Those are all good suggestions. All right. I think we're probably wrapping up, right? We said we were going to be done around now. I think we're wrapping up. I'm looking to see if we got to the questions as best as we could. I want to thank, before we split, I do want to thank everyone for your time, Alex and Andrea and Caitlin, and of course, Dean DiChristina, thank you for opening us up here. And the Alumni Relations Office for sort of helping arrange this, and everyone sort of jumping in and contributing to this. Thank you to the listeners too, and the people who sort of took the time to register and to be here today. We are going to try to put together a resource list. It'd be valuable for me. And I think we will try to do that, and we'll figure out a way to share that as much as we can, push that out there. And I think that's all I got. Anyone want to wrap up before we say goodbye?
Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here. Check out ESPN Daily, Monday through Friday, wherever you download podcasts.
Yes.
Yeah. Just
Everyone
thank
gets to
you for
plug.
having us.
Everyone gets to plug theirs.
Oh, great. Listen to
Time
Finding Raffi everywhere
Yes.
you listen to your podcast.
I know. Now I've got Baby Beluga in my head. Thank you for that.
Now you can listen to Banana Phone. Think about
Oh my
Banana
God.
Phone now.
Ooh. And you can check out the Bechdel Cast on all the places where you'd find a podcast.
That's awesome. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the time. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we look forward to maybe seeing you down the road again, but we'll certainly look forward to hearing you out there in our headphones.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.